The limits of Mao's dialectics. The most reliable sign of capitalism's ideological triumph is the virtual disappearance of the very term over the last 2 or 3 decades. In the 1980s, virtually no one, with the exception of a few allegedly archaic Marxists, an endangered species, referred to capitalism any longer. The term was simply struck from the vocabulary of politicians, trade unionists, writers, and journalists, not to mention social scientists, who had consigned it to historical oblivion. So what about the upsurge of the anti-globalization movement over the last few years? Does it not clearly contradict this diagnostic? Not at all. A close examination quickly demonstrates that this movement also succumbs to the temptation to transform a critique of capitalism itself, centered on economic mechanisms, forms of work organization, and profit extraction, into a critique of imperialism. In this way, when one talks about globalization and its agents, the enemy is externalized, often in the form of vulgar anti-Americanism. From this perspective, the main task today is to fight the American empire, and any ally is fine if it is anti-American. Thus, unbridled Chinese communist capitalism, violent Islamist anti-modernism, as well as the obscene Lukashenko regime in Belarus, see Chavez's visit to Belarus in July 2006, may appear as progressive anti-globalist comrades in arms. What we have here is thus another version of the ill-famed notion of alternative modernity. Instead of the critique of capitalism as such, instead of confronting its basic mechanism, we have the critique of the imperialist excess, with the tacit idea of mobilizing capitalist mechanisms within another, more progressive framework. This is how one should approach what is arguably Mao's central contribution to Marxist philosophy, his elaborations on the notion of contradiction. One should not dismiss them as a worthless philosophical regression, which, as one can easily demonstrate, relies on a vague notion of contradiction, which simply means struggle of opposing tendencies. The main thesis of his great text on contradiction regarding the 2 facets of contradiction, the principal and the non-principal contradictions in a process, and the principal and non-principal aspects of a contradiction, deserves a close reading. Mao's reproach to the dogmatic Marxists is that they do not understand that it is precisely in the particularity of contradiction that the universality of contradiction resides. For instance, in capitalist society, the 2 forces in contradiction, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, form the principal contradiction. The other contradictions, such as those between the remnant feudal class and the bourgeoisie, between the peasant petty bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie, between the proletariat and the peasant petty bourgeoisie, between the non-monopoly capitalists and the monopoly capitalists, between bourgeois democracy and bourgeois fascism, among the capitalist countries, and between imperialism and the colonies, are all determined or influenced by this principal contradiction. When imperialism launches a war of aggression against such a country, all its various classes, except for some traitors, can temporarily unite in a national war against imperialism. At such a time, the contradiction between imperialism and the country concerned becomes the principal contradiction, while all the contradictions among the various classes within the country, including what was the principal contradiction between the feudal system and the great masses of the people, are temporarily relegated to a secondary and subordinate position. This is Mao's key point. The principal, universal, contradiction does not overlap with the contradiction which should be treated as dominant in a particular situation. The universal dimension literally resides in this particular contradiction. In each concrete situation, a different particular contradiction is the predominant one, in the precise sense that in order to win the battle for the resolution of the principal contradiction, one should treat a particular contradiction as the predominant one, to which all other struggles should be subordinated. In China, under Japanese occupation, patriotic unity against the Japanese was the predominant feature if communists wanted to win in the class struggle. In these conditions, any direct focus on class struggle harms the class struggle itself. Therein, perhaps, resides the main feature of dogmatic opportunism, to insist on the centrality of the principal contradiction at the wrong moment. The further key point concerns the principal aspect of the contradiction. For example, with regard to the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production. The productive forces, practice, and the economic base generally play the principal and decisive role. Whoever denies this is not a materialist. But it must also be admitted that in certain conditions, such aspects as the relations of production, theory, and the superstructure in turn manifest themselves in the principal and decisive role. When it is impossible for the productive forces to develop without a change in the relations of production, then the change in the relations of production plays the principal and decisive role. The political stakes of this debate are decisive. Mao's aim is to assert the key role in the political struggle of what the Marxist tradition usually refers to as the subjective factor, theory, the superstructure. This is what, according to Mao, Stalin neglected. Stalin's Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, from first to last, says nothing about the superstructure. It is not concerned with people. It considers things, not people. It speaks only of the production relations, not of the superstructure, nor politics, nor the role of the people. Communism cannot be reached unless there is a communist movement. Alain Badiou, a true Maoist here, applies this to the contemporary constellation, avoiding the focus on the anti-capitalist struggle, even ridiculing its main form today, the anti-globalization movement, and defining the emancipatory struggle in strictly political terms as the struggle against liberal democracy, today's predominant ideologico-political form. Today, the enemy is not called empire or capital. It's called democracy. What today prevents the radical questioning of capitalism itself is precisely the belief in the democratic form of the struggle against capitalism. Lenin's stance against economism, as well as against pure politics, is crucial today, apropos the split attitude towards the economy in what remains of the left. On the one hand, the pure politicians abandon the economy as the site of struggle and intervention. On the other hand, the economists, fascinated by the functioning of the contemporary global economy, preclude any possibility of a political intervention proper. With regard to this split, today, more than ever, we should return to Lenin. Yes, the economy is the key domain. The battle will be decided there. One has to break the spell of global capitalism, but the intervention should be properly political, not economic. Today, when everyone is anti-capitalist, up to and including the Hollywood socio-critical conspiracy movies, from The Enemy of the State to The Insider, in which the enemy are the big corporations with their ruthless pursuit of profit, the signifier anti-capitalism has lost its subversive sting. What one should problematize is the self-evident opposite of this anti-capitalism, the trust in democracy by honest Americans who break up the conspiracy. This is the hard kernel of today's global capitalist universe, its true master signifier, democracy itself. Mao's further elaboration on the notion of contradiction in his On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Among the People, 1957, also cannot be reduced to its best-known feature, the rather common-sense point of distinguishing between the antagonistic and the non-antagonistic contradictions. The contradictions between ourselves and the enemy are antagonistic contradictions. Within the ranks of the people, the contradictions among the working people are non-antagonistic, while those between the exploited and the exploiting classes have a non-antagonistic as well as an antagonistic aspect. Under the people's democratic dictatorship, two different methods, one dictatorial and the other democratic, should be used to resolve the two types of contradictions which differ in nature, those between ourselves and the enemy, and those among the people. One should always read this distinction together with its more ominous supplement, a warning that the two aspects may overlap. In ordinary circumstances, contradictions among the people are not antagonistic, but if they are not handled properly, or if we relax our vigilance and lower our guard, antagonism may arise. Democratic dialogue, the peaceful coexistence of different orientations in the working class, is not something that is simply given, a natural state of things. It is something that is won and sustained by vigilance and struggle. Here, too, struggle has priority over unity. The very space of unity has to be won through struggle. So what are we to do with these elaborations? One should be very precise in diagnosing, at the very abstract level of theory, where Mao was right and where he was wrong. Mao was right in rejecting the standard notion of dialectical synthesis as the reconciliation of the opposites, as a higher unity which encompasses their struggle. He was wrong in formulating this rejection, this insistence on the priority of struggle, of division, over every synthesis or unity, in terms of a general cosmology ontology of the eternal struggle of opposites. This is why he got caught up in the simplistic, properly non-dialectical notion of the bad infinity of struggle. Mao clearly regresses here to primitive pagan wisdoms on how every creature, every determinate form of life, sooner or later meets its end. One thing destroys another. Things emerge, develop, and are destroyed. Everywhere is like this. If things are not destroyed by others, then they destroy themselves. One should give Mao his due at this level. He pushes to the end in this direction, applying this principle to communism itself. See the following passage, in which Mao accomplishes a gigantic ontological leap forward from the division of the atomic nucleus into protons, antiprotons, and so on, to the inevitable division of communism into stages. I don't believe that communism will not be divided into stages, and that there will be no qualitative changes. Lenin said that all things can be divided. He gave the atom as an example, and said that not only can the atom be divided, but the electron too can be divided. Formally, however, it was held that it could not be divided. The branch of science devoted to splitting the atomic nucleus is still very young, only 20 or 30 years old. In recent decades, the scientists have resolved the atomic nucleus into its constituents, such as protons, antiprotons, neutrons, antineutrons, mesons, and antimasons. He even goes a step further and moves beyond humanity itself, forecasting, in a proto-Nietzschean way, the overcoming of man. The life of dialectics is the continuous movement toward opposites. Mankind will also finally meet its doom. When the theologians talk about doomsday, they are pessimistic and terrify people. We say the end of mankind is something which will produce something more advanced than mankind. Mankind is still in its infancy. Moreover, he envisages the rise of some animals themselves to the, what we consider today as exclusively human, level of consciousness. In the future, animals will continue to develop. I don't believe that men alone are capable of having two hands. Can't horses, cows, sheep evolve? Can only monkeys evolve? And can it be, moreover, that of all the monkeys only one species can evolve, and all the others are incapable of evolving? In 1 million years, 10 million years, will horses, cows, and sheep still be the same as those today? I think they will continue to change. Horses, cows, sheep, and insects will all change. Two things should be added to this cosmic perspective. First, one should remember that Mao is here talking to the inner circle of party ideologists. This is what accounts for the tone of sharing a secret not to be rendered in public, as if Mao is divulging his secret teaching. And, in fact, Mao's speculations closely echo so-called biocosmism, the strange combination of vulgar materialism and Gnostic spirituality, which formed an occult shadow ideology, the obscene secret teaching of Soviet Marxism. Repressed from public sight during the main period of the Soviet state, biocosmism was openly propagated only in the first and in the last 2 decades of Soviet rule. Its main theses were the goals of religion, collective paradise, the overcoming of all suffering, full individual immortality, the resurrection of the dead, the victory over time and death, the conquest of space far beyond the solar system, can be realized in terrestrial life through the development of modern science and technology. In the future, not only will sexual difference be abolished, with the rise of chaste posthumans reproducing themselves through direct biotechnical reproduction, it will also be possible to resurrect all the dead of the past, establishing their biological formulae through their remains and then re-engendering them. DNA had not yet been heard of, thus even erasing all past injustices, undoing past suffering and destruction. In this bright biopolitical communist future, not only humans but also animals, all living beings, will participate in a directly collectivized reason of the cosmos. Whatever one may say against Lenin's ruthless critique of Maxim Gorky's God-building, Bogograditelstva, the direct deification of man, one should bear in mind that Gorky himself collaborated with biocosmists. It is interesting to note resemblances between this biocosmism and contemporary techno-gnosis. Second, this cosmic perspective is for Mao not just an irrelevant philosophical caveat, it has precise ethico-political consequences. When Mao high-handedly dismisses the threat of the atomic bomb, he is not downplaying the scope of the danger. He is fully aware that such a war may lead to the extinction of humanity as such. So, to justify his defiance, he has to adopt the cosmic perspective, from which the end of life on Earth would hardly mean anything to the universe as a whole. This cosmic perspective also grounds Mao's dismissive attitude towards the human costs of economic and political endeavors. If one is to believe the latest biography of Mao, he caused the greatest famine in history by exporting food to Russia to buy atomic and other types of arms. 38 million people starved or were slave-driven to death in 1958-61. Mao supposedly knew exactly what was happening, saying, "Half of China may well have to die." This is the instrumental attitude at its most radical. Killing as part of a ruthless attempt to realize a goal, reducing people to disposable means. And what one should bear in mind is that the Nazi Holocaust was not the same. The murder of the Jews was not part of a rational strategy, but was autotelic, a meticulously planned, irrational excess. Recall the deportation of the last Jews from the Greek islands in 1944, just before the German retreat, or the massive use of trains for transporting Jews instead of war materiel in 1944. This is why Heidegger was wrong when he reduced the Holocaust to the industrial production of corpses. It was not that. Stalinist communism rather could be characterized better in this way. The conceptual consequence of this bad infinity that pertains to vulgar evolutionism is Mao's consistent rejection of the negation of the negation as a universal dialectical law. Thus the explicit polemic against Engels, incidentally following Stalin, who, in his On Dialectical and Historical Materialism, also does not mention the negation of the negation among the four main features of Marxist dialectics. Engels talked about the three categories, but as for me, I don't believe in two of those categories. The unity of opposites is the most basic law. The transformation of quality and quantity into one another is the unity of the opposites, quality and quantity. And the negation of the negation does not exist at all. There is no such thing as the negation of the negation. Affirmation, negation, affirmation, negation. In the development of things, every link in the chain of events is both affirmation and negation. Slaveholding society negated primitive society, but with reference to feudal society, it constituted, in turn, the affirmation. Feudal society constituted the negation in relation to slaveholding society, but it was in turn the affirmation with reference to capitalist society. Capitalist society was the negation in relation to feudal society, but it is in turn the affirmation in relation to socialist society. Along similar lines, Mao scathingly dismissed the category of the dialectical synthesis of opposites, promoting his own version of negative dialectics. Every synthesis was for him ultimately what Adorno, in his critique of Lukács, called erpresste Versöhnung, enforced reconciliation, at best a momentary pause in the ongoing struggle, which occurs not when the opposites are united, but when one side simply wins over the other. What is synthesis? You have all witnessed how the two opposites, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, were synthesized on the mainland. The synthesis took place like this. Their armies came, and we devoured them. We ate them bite by bite. One thing eating another, big fish eating little fish. This is synthesis. It has never been put like this in books. I have never put it this way in my books either. For his part, Yang Xianchen believes that two combine into one, and that synthesis is the indissoluble tie between two opposites. What indissoluble ties are there in this world? Things may be tied, but in the end they must be severed. There is nothing which cannot be severed. Note, again, the tone of sharing a secret not to be rendered public, the cruel realistic lesson that undermines the happy public optimism. This was at the core of the famous debate in the late 1950s about the one and the two. Are the two united into one, or is the one divided into two? In any given thing, the unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, and transitory, and hence relative, whereas the struggle of opposites is absolute. This brings us to what one is tempted to call Mao's ethico-political injunction. To paraphrase the last word of Beckett's L'Annonable, in the silence you don't know, you must go on severing. I can't go on. I'll go on severing. The paradox of Mao's radical politics, of the eternally ongoing division, which never reaches the final point of peace, is that it rejoins its opposite, the rightist social democratic revision whose founder Bernstein proposed the well-known formula. The goal is nothing. The movement is everything. So where does Mao fall short here? In the way he opposes this injunction to sever, to divide, to dialectical synthesis. When Mao mockingly refers to synthesizing as the destruction of the enemy or his subordination, his mistake resides in this very mocking attitude. He does not see that this is the true Hegelian synthesis. After all, what is the Hegelian negation of the negation? First, the old order is negated within its own ideological-political form. Then, this form itself has to be negated. Those who vacillate, those who are afraid to take the second step of overcoming this form itself, are those who, to repeat Robespierre, want a revolution without a revolution. And Lenin displays all the strength of his hermeneutics of suspicion in discerning the different forms of this retreat. The true victory, the true negation of the negation, occurs when the enemy talks your language. In this sense, a true victory is a victory in defeat. It occurs when one specific message is accepted as a universal framework, even by the enemy. For example, in the case of rational science versus belief, the true victory of science takes place when the church starts to defend itself in the language of science. Or in the contemporary politics of the UK, as many a perspicuous commentator has observed, the Thatcher revolution was in itself chaotic, impulsive, marked by unpredictable contingencies, and it was only the third-way Blairite government that was able to institutionalize it, to stabilize it into new institutional forms, or, to put it in Hegelese, to raise what first appeared as a contingency, a historical accident, into necessity. In this sense, Blair repeated Thatcherism, elevating it into a concept, in the same way that, for Hegel, Augustus repeated Caesar, transforming, sublating a contingent, personal name into a concept, a title. Thatcher was not a Thatcherite, she was just herself. It was only Blair, more than John Major, who truly forged Thatcherism as a notion. The dialectical irony of history is that only a nominal ideological political enemy can do this to you, can elevate you into a concept. The imperial instigator has to be knocked off. Julius Caesar had to be murdered. Thatcher had to be ignominiously deposed. This is the surprising lesson of the last decades, the lesson of West European third-way social democracy, but also the lesson of the Chinese communists presiding over what is arguably the most explosive development of capitalism in the entirety of human history. We can do it better. Recall the classical Marxist account of the overcoming of capitalism. Capitalism unleashed the breathtaking dynamics of self-enhancing productivity. In capitalism, all that is solid melts into air. Capitalism is the greatest revolutionizer in the history of humanity. On the other hand, this capitalist dynamic is propelled by its own inner obstacle, or antagonism. The ultimate limit of capitalism, of capitalist self-propelling productivity, is capital itself, that is, Capitalism's incessant development and revolutionizing of its own material conditions, the mad dance of its unconditional spiral of productivity, is ultimately nothing but a desperate fuite en avant to escape its own debilitating inherent contradictions. Marx's fundamental mistake was here to conclude, from these insights, that a new, higher social order, communism, was possible. An order that would not only maintain, but even raise to a higher degree and fully release the potential of the upward spiral of productivity, without it being thwarted by socially destructive economic crises. In short, what Marx overlooked is that, to put it in standard Derridian terms, this inherent obstacle, antagonism, as the condition of impossibility, of the full deployment of the productive forces is simultaneously its condition of possibility. If we abolish the obstacle, the inherent contradiction of capitalism, we do not get the fully unleashed drive finally freed from its shackles, but rather we lose precisely this very productivity that seemed to be simultaneously generated and stifled by capitalism, for it simply dissipates. And it is as if this logic of the obstacle as a positive condition, which underlay the failure of socialist attempts to overcome capitalism, is now returning with a vengeance in capitalism itself. Capitalism can fully thrive not in the unencumbered reign of the market, but only when an obstacle, from minimal welfare state intervention up to and including the direct political rule of the Communist Party, as in the case of China, constrains its unimpeded rampage. So, ironically, this is the synthesis of capitalism and communism in Mao's sense. In a unique kind of poetic justice on a historic scale, it was capitalism which synthesized Maoist communism. The key new feature in China over the last few years has been the emergence of a large-scale workers' movement protesting against the work conditions, which are the price China pays for rapidly becoming the world's foremost manufacturing power. A movement which has faced brutal repression. New proof, if it is still needed, that China is today the ideal capitalist state. Freedom for capital, with the state doing the dirty job of controlling the workers. China, as the emerging superpower of the 21st century, thus seems to embody a new kind of capitalism. Disregard for ecological consequences, disdain for workers' rights, everything subordinated to the ruthless drive to develop and become the new world force. The big question is, what will the Chinese do with regard to the biogenetic revolution? Is it not a safe wager that they will hurl themselves into unconstrained genetic manipulation of plants, animals, and humans, bypassing all our Western moral prejudices and limitations? This is the ultimate price for Mao's theoretical mistake of rejecting the negation of the negation, of his failure to grasp how the negation of the negation is not a compromise between a position and its successively radical negation, but on the contrary, the only true negation. And it is because Mao is unable to theoretically formulate this self-relating negation of form itself that he gets caught in the bad infinity of endless negating, scissions into two, subdivision. In Hegelese, Mao's dialectic remains at the level of understanding, of fixed notional oppositions. It is unable to formulate the properly dialectical self-relating of notional determinations. It is this serious mistake, to use a Stalinist term, which led Mao, when he was courageous enough to draw all the consequences from his stances, to reach a properly nonsensical conclusion that, in order to invigorate class struggle, one should directly open up the field to the enemy. Let them go in for capitalism. Society is very complex. If one only goes in for socialism and not for capitalism, isn't that too simple? Wouldn't we then lack the unity of opposites and be merely one-sided? Let them do it. Let them attack us madly, demonstrate in the streets, take up arms to rebel. I approve of all these things. Society is very complex. There is not a single commune, a single scene, a single department of the Central Committee, which one cannot divide into two. This notion of dialectics provides the basic matrix of Mao's politics. Its repeated oscillation between liberal openness and then the hard-line purge. First, let the proverbial 100 flowers blossom so that the enemies will actualize and fully express their reactionary hidden tendencies. Then, once everyone's true positions are clearly articulated, engage in a ruthless struggle. Again, what Mao fails to do here is to proceed to the properly Hegelian identity of opposites. and to recognize in the force the revolution is fighting and trying to annihilate its own essence. As is the case in G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, in which the secret police chief organizing the search for the anarchist leader and this mysterious leader, in the end, appear to be one and the same person. God himself, incidentally. And did Mao himself ultimately not play a similar role, that of a secular God who is at the same time the greatest rebel against himself? What this Chestertonian identity of the good Lord with the anarchist rebel enacts is the logic of the social carnival brought to the extreme of self-reflection. Anarchist outbursts are not a transgression of law and order. In our societies, anarchism already is in power wearing the mask of law and order. Our justice is the travesty of justice. The spectacle of law and order is an obscene carnival. The point made clear by arguably the greatest political poem in English, Shelley's The Mask of Anarchy, which describes the obscene parade of the figures of power. And many more destructions played in this ghastly masquerade, all disguised even to the eyes, like bishops, lawyers, peers, or spies. Last came Anarchy. He rode on a white horse splashed with blood. He was pale even to the lips, like death in the apocalypse. And he wore a kingly crown, and in his grasp a sceptre shone. On his brow this mark I saw: I am God, and King, and Law. This identity is difficult to assume, even in cinema. Although V for Vendetta was praised, by none other than Toni Negri, among others, and even more criticized for its radical, pro-terrorist even stance, it does not push the logic to the end. It shirks from drawing the consequences from the parallels between Sutler and V, the totalitarian dictator, and the anarchist terrorist rebel. The Norsefire Party is, we learn, the instigator of the terror it is fighting. But what about the further identity of Sutler and V? In both cases, we never see their real faces, except the scared Sutler at the very end when he's about to die. Sutler we see only on TV screens, and V is a specialist in manipulating the screen. Furthermore, V's dead body is placed on the train packed with explosives, in a kind of Viking funeral, strangely evoking the name of the ruling party, Norsefire. So when Evie is imprisoned and tortured by V in order to learn how to overcome fear and be free, is this not parallel to what Sutler does to the entire English population, terrorizing them so that they become free and rebel? But the film fails to draw this Chestertonian lesson of the ultimate identity between V and Sutler.